So welcome everyone to our webinar. We are so excited to hear from Anna Greenberg today on whether or not Democrats were focusing too much on women's issues during the 2014 election. So if you would like to ask questions, we will have time toward the end of the presentation for Q&A. Just click the Q&A button at the top of your Zoom software, and I will be moderating our Q&A as we get closer. So before I hand it off to Anna, I'd just like to introduce her and tell you a little bit more about her and her experience. So Anna Greenberg has over 15 years of experience polling in the political, nonprofit, and academic sectors. She joined GQRR in 2001 after teaching public opinion and survey research methodology at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She was the lead pollster in many successful campaigns, including the Mayor Bill de Blasio, Governor Tom Wolf, Governor Mark Dayton, former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, Congressman Ron Barber, and Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham. In 2014, Greenberg won the Pollster of the Year award from the AAPC for her work with Mayor Bill de Blasio's campaign for mayor of New York City. Greenberg works with a wide range of NGOs on issues ranging from women's health to LGBT rights to attitudes about religion to reducing gun violence to reforming drug laws. She heads GQR's digital and is a leader in the growing field of data analytics and micro-targeting, measuring the impact of social media on public opinion and using social media to move voters, consumers, and activists. A sought-after commentator, Greenberg has appeared on CBS's Face the Nation, NPR's All Things Considered and Morning Edition, and BBC's World News America. She regularly provides commentary on politics to publications including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico. Greenberg serves on the national board of the American National Election Study and is a research fellow at American University Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. She holds a BA in government from Cornell University and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And I'd love to help you all welcome Anna Greenberg to our webinar. So Anna.
Great. Thank you. First of all, I apologize for the technical delay. We had it set up and then somehow we got logged out and we had to figure out how to get logged back in again. I also didn't realize that I would be on video, so I'm just happy that I am actually wearing work clothes and wasn't home doing this in my pajamas. The question that I'm going to address is this whole issue of whether or not, so-called women's issues were the reason why Democrats lost. Certainly there was an argument made, for example, in the Colorado Senate race that there had been too much discussion of quote unquote women's issues, and that was part of why Udall lost to Gardner. So it's actually sort of a difficult question. It's a kind of counterfactual kinds of question, because I don't think it actually is the reason why Democrats lost, but it's actually, I don't have necessarily direct data to bring to bear on the question. So it actually made more sense to me to actually talk a little bit about 2014 and what actually happened, what I think drove the actual result, and then what I think it means for 2016. So I'll talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I think hopefully we can have a good Q&A for those of you that managed to stay with us through the technical delays. So without further ado, the first thing to note about 2014, and I'm sure that you will know this, is that we had historically low turnout. Turnout was lower in midterm election presidential years. That's not a surprise. But if you look at what happened in 2014, 36% turnout was the lowest in 70 years. Now, that is a big explanation. It's a big part of the story about what happened in this election year, which is to say that in a lot of places where Democrats lost, or Democrats who we thought would win easily, won by the skin of their teeth, it was really driven by a drop in turnout, in particular in Democratic turnout. Actually, I'm going to skip to a slide and oops, it's not there. Yeah. So this is a question that we ask people about their level of interest in an election. And what this measure helps us do is it's sort of a measure of turnout. It's not an exact measure of turnout, but it certainly is related to turnout. And what you can see here is that, and this is the post-election survey done by Democracy Corps, what you can see here is that among Republicans, reported enthusiasm about voting was 64, gave a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. Among Democrats, it was 53, gave a 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. And mean, the numbers themselves aren't inherently meaningful, but what's meaningful is the difference between Democrats and Republicans. That Republicans were 11 points kind of more enthusiastic about voting in 2014 than Democrats. And then if you look at kind of the key Republican base voters, you can see that Tea Party Republicans, 84% of them were very enthusiastic, a 10 on voting. Seniors who drive midterm elections, quite conservative, especially white seniors, 68%, a 10. You see evangelical Republicans, 10, 62 a 10, non-RAE, meaning people who are not minority, younger women or younger, 60. And if you look at the Democratic base groups, for instance, if you look at millennials, 40%, were enthusiastic about voting. If you look at unmarried women, a group that Obama won, 70% of in 2012, 50% said they were enthusiastic about voting. So what you have is Republicans overall more enthusiastic about voting. And then within, if you look at the Republican base and the Democratic base, a lot more enthusiasm in the Republican base. And you can see how this played out in different places. So if you take states like Virginia, for example, which had a Senate race that sort of nobody thought was going to be competitive, no was on anybody's radar, and Mark Warner barely won. Well, if you look at turnout patterns, what you can see is, the turnout dropped just like any midterm election, but it's disproportionate and it's more likely to have come from Democratic leaning groups, and that's true. And throughout the election cycle, I can tell you that in the races that I was working on, we saw Democratic underperformance. I was involved in polling in the Massachusetts governor's race, in the Pennsylvania governor's race, in the Maine governor's race. I mainly worked on governor races this cycle. And what you could see is that the Democratic candidate was always less strong among Democrats than the Republican was among Republicans, which is actually a sign about sort of what's going to happen come election day. And so in the last 3 weeks before the election, you could really see the bottom drop out. The bottom really was dropping out because Democrats weren't kind of enthused about voting. Now, generally speaking, midterms are better for Republicans than Democrats. So some of this is just, and it's also we're in the 6th year of a presidential term where the party in power generally suffers losses. But what I saw over the last 2 or 3 years, but particularly with the rollout of healthcare.gov, was that we saw the disastrous rollout didn't really affect people's views about healthcare reform on the right because they already hated it. So if you looked at Republicans and independents who lean conservative, the rollout of the ACA just reinforced what they believed about healthcare reform. The problem was that we saw a decline in support for ACA among younger people, among women, especially blue-collar women, among Democrats. And that, sort of in some ways was, I don't know if you want to say like the icing on the cake for a series of things that undermine people's kind of confidence in the president and the administration. But you saw that clearly play out on election day. Now, in states where there were competitive races and there were real campaigns and there were people who had sort of field infrastructure, places like North Carolina, like Colorado, Wisconsin, places like that, turnout was actually not down, and in some cases turnout was actually higher than 2010. But what you saw is the turnout pattern in those states is that there was higher turnout in the Republican parts of the state than the Democratic parts of the state. So if you take North Carolina, for example, they met the Hagan campaign met many of their vote goals. But if you looked at turnout in the rural and small towns in North Carolina, turnout was way up over 2010. So kind of the Republican turnout leapfrogged over Democratic turnout, where they mostly met their vote goals. So a big part of what happened is about turnout, and it's consistent across state. It's consistent whether it's a state where there was not a competitive race. Even states that had competitive races, you can see the differences in turnout. And so part of my answer around, were women's issues driving this election, or did they have some detrimental impact? There was something much bigger going on than any set of one issues driving the actual outcome of the 2014 election. The notion that there's like one single issue that could be blamed for Democrats losing is a little bit absurd. And mostly people are focused on the Colorado race. So let me go back and talk a little bit about what the looked like in 2014. And what you can see here is, this is basically looking at the Democratic base and the Republican base, and then kind of people in the middle. And what you can see are a few things. One, reflecting the turnout patterns and the level of enthusiasm among Democrats versus Republicans, you can see that the Republican base was more consolidated than Democratic base. So Republicans won 95% of Republican candidates won 95% of Republican voters, while Democratic candidates won 91% of Democratic voters. It's only a 4-point difference, but in close races, if Republicans are more consolidated, it makes a big difference. And if you look, for example, at minority voters, and we don't have enough sample size to break out African American and Hispanic, but if you look at minority voters, you can see 75% voted Democratic. But if you look at white evangelicals, 83% voted Republican. So the kind of groups that we consider base Democratic groups at a lower level, and groups that are base Republican groups. And then, of course, we also lost the middle. So if you look at the independent bloc, you can see 43% voted for Democrats and 54% for Republicans. The independent bloc has become more conservative over time. In 2006, Democrats won independents by 22 points, and Obama won independents by 8 points in 2012. In 2008, in 2012, he broke even with independents. And so at this point, given what the independent bloc is starting to look like, it is, for Democrats to be competitive, they need to break even with independents at a minimum. I don't think anytime soon we're going to see double-digit wins among independents for Democrats, but at least need to break even. So even when it came to voting, you can see that there was underperformance for Democrats. Now, if we look at women, now we're looking at the last three midterm elections, and it's not a totally fair comparison because 2006 was a way Democratic year. And so what you can see, this is just looking at the national exit polls and looking at it by gender. You can see in 2006, Democrats won 55% of women, and yes, so just making sure the legend is correct, and basically broke even with men, and that produces a wave when you have that kind of lead among women, and then you're competitive with men. You can see in 2010, it's like the mirror, right? So instead of 2006, Republicans won women by 1 point, which actually was the first time in decades, I think, that Republicans had actually won that Republicans had won women, and you can see that men are at 55-41. So again, this is a story of a wave. You break even with women, but you have a huge lead with men, and you have a wave of performance for Republicans. Now, 2014, it's hard because in 2010 Democrats kept the Senate, and that was sort of the big story of that race, even though obviously it was a sweep where Democrats lost a lot of 2008 seats they picked up in a presidential year that really were Republican-leaning districts, and some of the 2006 districts they won in that wave. Really, 2010 was kind of a course correction. But because Democrats kept the Senate, it didn't seem like such a disaster. Well, obviously, this year, not only did we lose the Senate, but we also lost a lot of state legislatures. And there's historic Republican control over state legislatures. You can see that we actually didn't do as badly with women. Democrats won women by 4, but you can see that the margin's even worse among men. So even the marginal improvement among women, it can't balance out the improvement among men to create any kind of meaningful impact in this election. So we have now had 2 midterms in a row of performance among women, which also is part, if Democrats aren't winning women by 10 points or so, it's a real problem. So then the whole question of looking at what the issues were and whether or not then so-called women's issues were drivers. The economy was the #1 issue. These are the exit polls. It's a very simple slide, but I think we all know this, and we can get into during Q&A if you want to about what it means that the economy dominated. But what I think it means is that you have an economy that on macroeconomic indicators is doing better, and people know it, and you're seeing that reflected in people's evaluation of the economy, even though you still have a huge number of people saying the country's on the wrong track, that number had been getting better. But there was really not much of a robust economic conversation during the election. And so, if anything, it was somewhat more robust on the Republican side. So we had a very narrow and limited economic conversation in this election. And you have a bunch of people who can see that the economy is doing better, but they themselves don't feel like they're doing much better. And what we can see in the reports around growth, for example, the decline in the unemployment rate, is that there's been wage stagnation accompanied this the decline in the unemployment rate, which means people aren't actually doing better, even though there are more people working. So you have an economy that ostensibly is doing better. You have not much of an economic debate in the election, and a lot of people who don't feel very good. And that's kind of a recipe for losing big in a midterm election. So this question, we sort of asked the question about whether or not you think that the president and and it's asked in a few different, it's a forced choice that, we're talking about issues important to working women and single women versus not. And this comes from our work with Women's Voices, Women's Vote, to be specific about where these questions come from. You can see that, overall, sort of self-report, people don't think that and especially women, unmarried women, non-college women, don't think that the national political conversation has much to say about, the issues that affect them. And what's interesting about this slide, I mean, it's not a surprise. People are very cynical about politics, so it's not a surprise that the answer would say that the national debate is fairly empty. What's interesting is the numbers. For example, 55% is higher than the percentage of women who voted for Democratic candidate. So it's not just a bunch of Democrats kind of driving this response. There's actually, a significant number of independent women, for example, who think that the national debate didn't really deal with issues that were important to them. So the last thing I would just say very specifically on Colorado is we did post-election research for NARAL, and part of what we wanted, and for Planned Parenthood, was to evaluate the role that choice in particular played in that election. And what we found was two things. One, being pro-choice and agreeing with Mark Udall on choice issues was actually a predictor of the vote. So in other words, it was for many people who supported Mark Udall, that was an important driver of vote choice over and above partisanship. And the campaign itself, as I understand it, tested everything, sort of the whole range of issues with regards to Cory Gardner, and it was always the reproductive health and rights issues that tested the most strongly, and we could see that in the survey as well. The problem, honestly, was not so much that there was too much discussion of choice and so-called women's issues. It was that the economic debate was so empty. And so when we asked this question about which candidate do you think would do a better job on being for the middle class, for example, Mark Udall only won that by 3 points. And then we asked the question of who would do better at keeping corporate America accountable, and the voters were evenly split on whether Gardner or Udall would do a better job on that issue. So when, the core issue of the election is kind of the economy and people's feelings, their misgivings, their discontent, they're feeling like I'm being left behind, things are getting better, but I'm not feeling better. And you're wondering who people are for, who they stand up for, and you have a Senate race where that's clearly not clear to the voters. And so, it's less an issue that there was too much discussion on choice, and more that there wasn't a robust kind of economic conversation in that election. And initially, where Democrats won, there was that robust economic conversation. And I'd suggest you look at, for example, Jeanne Shaheen's ads, which were very, very heavily focused on positive and focused on economy. So with that, I'm going to stop because we started late, so I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. And I don't know how the system works for Q&A, so presumably somebody's going to tell me what to do.
Yes, I will be moderating Q&A. So again, if folks have questions about what Anna presented here around the research and polling, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box that should be at the top of your software. And we'll start with the first question. So the first one is around Hillary Clinton being elected for president. So I know it's very early and she hasn't even declared, but I have friends who are very concerned about the electability of Hillary Clinton for president, despite the fact that she actually received more total votes than Barack Obama in the 2008 primaries. Can you tell us any polling information relevant to her electability?
Well, so that's a really good question. And there is, already polling that on the presidential race. It really started at the beginning of this year, and there's some good websites to go to. Talking Points, Memo, pollster.com, and Real Clear Politics all are tracking presidential. And what we see, two things. One is that Hillary Clinton is consistently ahead of Republicans, though, and big leads if it's if she's matched up against someone like Chris Christie, and a decent lead against someone like Jeb Bush, much tighter when she's up against Scott Walker. Scott Walker is the most popular Republican candidates right now. However, a lot of people don't know him. So there's, some of this is just reflecting he's a generic Republican, and he's not carrying around the baggage of a Bush or a Christie and the like. So what I would say is that she's under 50% in most of those polls, which means this race is competitive because the Republican primary is not sorted yet, and we don't know who her opponent will be. But she's starting under 50 in most polls, and so that means it looks like a competitive race. And favorability has declined since the beginning of the year. So again, if you go to those websites, you can see that her favorability has narrowed. Some of this, I think, stems from her not having a campaign yet. And so there's no real coherent narrative coming out of the Clinton campaign or the nascent or would-be Clinton campaign. And I'm not suggesting that all will be well when that happens, but I do think once there's an actual campaign with, you know, an actual kind of narrative about her and why her. I believe that, you know, and instead we have mostly negative stories about donations to the Clinton Foundation or email. So once her campaign fills that vacuum, I think she will look stronger. But at the moment, it looks like, I wouldn't say she looks vulnerable, but I would say it looks like a very, very competitive presidential race. But we're very far out. We don't know anything about who's going to actually be the nominee. You know, someone like Jeb Bush is very flawed. I like a matchup against him. So we're just going to have to see what happens once there's actually a Clinton campaign. I can see the questions now. So should I just go ahead and answer them, or should I read them out to everybody?
Sure, it's up to you, whatever works best for you.
Okay. So there's a question that says, I'm wondering when there's been so much good info and polling about economic issues, why say women's issues came up as a problem at all? Is it just a scapegoat for the Democrats thrashing? There hasn't been any evidence that women's issues had a negative or a detrimental impact on Democrats in the election. But what I think happened was that the Colorado race became kind of the symbol, and that issue so dominated that Senate race that was a race where I think people were surprised Udall ended up in so much trouble. So that it was a race where it was fairly easy to say, well, that was driving why he lost. Now, that ignores history. I mean, the campaign against Ken Buck was largely fought on reproductive rights. You know, so there already is a history of statewide campaigns won by Democrats where reproductive rights is a major part of the conversation. But I think it became kind of the scapegoat because there really isn't any evidence, and it's really the only campaign where there was so much discussion of reproductive rights. Okay. So says we have state and local elections this year in Virginia. We're considering we are coming from such a tough 14, what advice to women running 15? Many are running. Merge has made a difference with them. Well, I mean, some of this is just practical campaign advice, but raise as much money as you possibly can and spend as little of it until you actually engage in paid communications. I mean, that's couldn't be more important in being competitive. But I do think that there is a real set of issues that pertain to women's economic standing, but I think have broad applicability that I think that we should be talking about. And, you know, much of the research I've done for Emily's List and Democracy Corps' done with Women's Voice Vote shows that when you're talking about the things that would improve women's and then families, and therefore men too, kind of financial standing, that you really connect with people. And it's about the things that actually matter to them day to day, how much they get paid. So maybe that's minimum wage, or whether or not they have paid sick time, whether or not they have flexibility in their workplace, especially for people who are hourly wage workers. And so there's a whole range of ways to connect with people on the economy as they are living it, which I think is different than what happened in 2014. I also think there's a real powerful narrative around kind of pivoting to, kind of economic opportunity, and how do you either get ahead or sort of stay in the middle class in an economy like this. So that would be my advice in terms of what you should be talking to voters about. I say that without having done any research in these Virginia races, but based on just everything else that I'm working on and thinking about. There's a question that says, how can we tie reproductive rights to economic issues since they're linked? You know, it's really hard. I think someone like Tim Kaine did a good job of it, and you can make the linkage. But I've done focus groups with millennials on choice, and it's always an interesting set of people to talk to about an issue that they have historical knowledge of how we got to where we are in it. But one of the arguments I always test, because I learned it in my women's studies class in college, is that, you know, when women got control over their reproductive capacity, they were able to actually go to college and go into the workforce. And so actually being able to control your reproductive capacity, whether it's through birth control or access to abortion, actually is kind of central to women's economic independence. That argument goes nowhere. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, for a bunch of women who sort of have always seem to think they've lived in an era of kind of equal rights, and where choice is legal, it kind of seems absurd that these issues are linked to women's economic standing. So even though we know it's true, it's actually a pretty hard argument to make, especially for people who don't really have any historical knowledge of why controlling reproduction would matter for competing in the economy, or for being able to have economic security. But Planned Parenthood, makes the linkage, and I've seen it in lots of places where you talk about it in the context of economic issues. It's just hard argument for people to kind of put together. Okay. Messaging, I believe, is a very strong problem. Democrats have done a very poor job of this, and it's hard to sell product as a result. As a multi-term successful campaign manager for my state legislator in Maine, we've been frustrated and not hearing enough public self-applause. All women are touched by elections. We're not getting that message out to them. No, I would agree that Democrats lacked kind of economic message or an economic narrative. And honestly, I think that stems from the top. I don't think there's been much of one from the Obama administration, basically since 2009. And there certainly wasn't one around healthcare reform while that debate was happening. There was a post hoc effort to figure out messaging and selling it that was never successful. So I think part of the problem in 2014 around message was something that's more systemic and long-term. It's not just a reflection of Democrats didn't have something to say in 2014, but I think it's actually a reflection of a fairly empty narrative. I think for a period of time in 2012, the presidential was about the middle class and about 47%, and it was more populist, and that's actually when Obama sort of basically was able to seal the deal and win that race. But I would say mostly the last 7 years have been sort of devoid of a strong economic narrative for Democrats on or talk about. Are there other questions? Well, there's a question. So Amy's asking another question. I'll answer your question since there aren't other ones. In the stats about independents voting more Republican than Democrat, how are independents defined? By party affiliation or self-definition? Okay, so this whole question of how you assess what someone's party identification is, you can do it in two ways. You can do it from registration information on the file. So for example, in California, you have an independent party and decline to state. Or you can also do it through self-definition, where we have a fairly well-established 7-point scale question used to place people on the partisan, to place someplace on the partisan scale. And we generally look at both, but mostly we're looking at self-described independence because there is not an exact correspondence with how people register and then how they actually self-identify. And politically, self-identification is a little bit stronger as a predictor of behavior. Generally, in states that have registration, we will have a banner point for self-report party, and we'll have a banner point for registration. And sometimes they look fairly close to each other, and sometimes they don't. Like in the South, for example, registration is really deceiving because you still, believe it or not, have historical Democratic Party registration in the South, but obviously many fewer people calling themselves Democrats. So you always have to be a little careful in looking at registration and looking at self-identification. Is there any evidence that Democrats other than Hillary is viable? People asking enthusiasm for it. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are viable. I mean, this Republican field is not terribly strong, and I think Republicans have some problems coming into 2016, which is to say, the economy is likely to be even stronger next year, and so the core economic narrative that Republicans have about Democrats is obviously challenged by the fact that the economy is doing pretty well. Part of the reason why I think you see Republicans talking about wage stagnation and inequality is that they, understand that it's hard to say that Obama's policies have kind of failed the economy since the economy is doing better. So you've got, a bunch of yahoos running, which, someone like Walker may end up being great, or may have been being the Tim Plenty, of 2016, who knows. But you have a bunch of yahoos, crazy people running, and you've got, I think, a lot of uncertainty on the Republican side on how to talk about domestic issues. And in that context, there's no reason why a good Democrat wouldn't be competitive just like Hillary. I've not seen, a ton of polling matching other people up against the Republicans. And honestly, for someone like Warren, her name ID nationally is not really high enough to really gauge the strength of what she would be as a candidate. I don't know if everyone can see these. Amy's asking me if Yahoo is a technical term. Yes, we learned it in polling 101 about Yahoos. So anyway, there's no a priori reason why another Democrat wouldn't be strong against Republicans. It just hasn't really been tested in a way that that would be a fair representation of what would actually happen. There's an anonymous question about the Maryland Senate race. So I'm not involved in the Maryland Senate race, so I'll say that now. There's so many people running, so many political consultants in Washington now working in that race. I will tell you that a dynamic that is very important to pay attention to in Maryland is the racial makeup of the primary electorate, which is about between 40 and 43% African American. So, I'm not in this race for anybody in particular, but I'm just saying from a kind of a data perspective, Having one African American candidate, for example, in a primary is enormously helpful for whoever that person is. So if it's Donna Edwards, that's a huge deal. Probably Anthony Brown won the primary for governor. Also, Doug Gansler ran a terrible campaign, but it was that too. So I don't know if she, what her chances are. I haven't seen any polling. None of these folks will have high name ID statewide. I mean, as prominent as Chris Van Hollen is, he will not be known outside of Montgomery County. So none of these congressional members of Congress who are running will have very high name ID statewide. So I imagine an early primary poll would all have them in single digits and with a high undecided. But like I said, the racial makeup of the Democratic primary electorate in Maryland does have a big impact on the race. And obviously it's an advantage for Donna Edwards if she's the only African American candidate. Okay. I did answer the Virginia question. I thought I answered the Virginia question. I don't have any specific data about what to run on in Virginia. I talked about sort of how I would talk about economic issues in those races. Anybody else want to ask a question? So we have another one from Amy, if people want me to keep going. So this is question whether or not Hillary Clinton's campaign can actually establish a strong narrative that would override mainstream coverage, and can she dominate, economy and security issues? Yes, I think that if she runs a well-funded, professional campaign, there's absolutely no reason why she will not be able to kind of out-communicate the haters or the right-wing media. And the truth is, media consumption is very polarized. So most people watching Fox are Republicans. So people who are watching those kinds of shows are not persuadable voters. It's people who, frankly, aren't watching any news shows at all, or actually are persuadable voters. There are low information deciders. And again, a well-run, well-funded Hillary Clinton campaign absolutely can break through the negativity. But obviously, until she actually announces, it's hard right now. It feels like a vacuum, and it's hard to know how competitive she'll be. I don't see why she couldn't dominate economic issues. I mean, I don't know if anyone on this call was at the Amazon dinner last month, or maybe it was earlier this month, but she had a very, most of her speech was about kind of the women's economic agenda. And so I actually am biased because I think that's actually a very important set of issues to talk about, and one that's not just popular with voters, but actually is cross-partisan. So, for example, on ending gender discrimination in pay has significant Republican support. So it's actually, I think, not just an issue that's important to talk about and central to people's economic standing, but it's actually one that kind of crosses party and ideology. So I think, so I don't know what she's going to do, but if that's the set of issues she might talk about, I think that would be a very strong, unique narrative that she could communicate. And I think she would have authenticity around it, given going back to Beijing, where she's been on women's issues broadly. And it's sort of unfortunate that she had the, the email press conference right on the heels of, what's wrong? Sorry. And by the way, there's a jackhammer outside my door, so I hope you guys can hear me over the jackhammer. I mean, outside my window. I forgot what I was saying. Okay. So gun control, backlash. I do a lot of work on guns, particularly on background checks. I did the background check initiative in Washington State. And the truth is, at least, and I don't know specifically what the SAFE Act is about, but certainly on the issue of background checks, it gets very high levels of support. It gets high level of support among even members of the NRA. I have seen no evidence that, at least, when gun issues are framed in terms of, I don't want to say the word mainstream because I happen to think most gun control issues are mainstream, but politically mainstream ways of talking about it and mainstream ways to deal with it legislatively, I haven't seen much evidence of the backlash. I mean, if you look at Connecticut, for example, where Malloy did some pretty significant stuff on guns post Newtown, he barely got reelected, but it had nothing to do with guns. He was just not very popular. And in fact, he advertised, as did I worked for Gabby Giffords' group, and we advertised on gun issues in Connecticut. So, where it's been used as an issue, there hasn't been much evidence of kind of conservative backlash, but even more so, most people, agree with kind of common sense gun control measures. So I also think that the NRA's power has been sort of grossly overstated. They've lost a lot of elections in the last 2 or 3 election cycles they played in. You know, the gun control side actually has now money to compete with the NRA in a lot of places. And I think a lot of the reason why it's been so hard to pass common sense gun laws has been about political courage and not really about public opinion. But the NRA is less powerful than people think it is. Okay, Senator Gillibrand's Family Act and future success passing the Family Act. Well, so, I mean, obviously it can be difficult for a Democrat to pass anything. So, you know, her, and I believe that Rosa DeLauro introduced the companion piece in the House. I think it's important to introduce this over and over again. I think it's very mainstream. I think, again, it's kind of cross partisan. And, you know, but it's nothing to pass in this Congress. So I think it's more of a education tool, you know, something that people can talk about on the campaign trail. It's one where there's a huge amount of support for it in the public, but nothing's going to happen in Congress.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you again, Anna, for joining us and, you know, sort of spreading your wisdom amongst our attendees and supporters of Emerge. I hope you all enjoyed her talk, and the Q&A, and having such an interactive component was incredibly helpful. So thank you for that. And for those of us who are still on with us, our next webinar is April 29th. So we do them the last Wednesday of the month, typically noon Pacific, which is 3 o'clock Eastern. And our topic will be announced soon, so stay tuned for our April webinar topic. And thank you again, Anna, for joining us, and for those of you who asked questions and participated on today's panel and discussion. All right, have a great rest of the day, everyone.